What's cracking, guys? Omar Isaf here, back with another video. You should be scared when I prepared some notes for a video because we're going in depth. If you care about aesthetics, looking yucky, juicy, shiny, whatever, proportion, this video is for you. I want to talk about the golden era of aesthetics. I want to talk about how to individualize your training in order to get the outcome that you want, but how in ways the golden era might be unattainable for some individuals, and that's okay because once again, we have to take into account every individual's anatomy, your skeletal structure, the muscle insertions and origins. I'm going to talk about all that, but I want to talk about an individual who a lot of people, myself included, find very aesthetic, and that would be Steve Reeves, where this kind of is an individual that has spawned countless imitators throughout time. And when we talk about the golden era of aesthetics, we're talking more about proportion, symmetry when it comes to physique, so not mass monsters. Some of these individuals, so I'm actually going to talk about John Grimek, so I'm going to rewind a bit, then I'm going to fast forward. There's a lot of different physiques we want to talk about here. We got Eugene Sandow. All this to say, much like strength training, if you care about strength training, customizing this for the individual variability is very important, and ultimately, once again, your structure is going to determine a lot. And I'm going to use myself as an example. Remember, this is n=1 sample size. I'm talking specifically about me in certain instances, but I'm going to give a very general application, because if we take a look, what is aesthetics? Okay, it would be proportion, symmetry, and size, and they're in a combination. And throughout time, that has changed what individuals find aesthetic. For some people, the X-frame, so being a mass monster, so someone like a Jay Cutler or Ronnie Coleman, they might find that more aesthetic than an individual like a Steve Reeves or John Grimek. Eugene Sandow comes from a different era. I want to talk about the equipment. I want to talk about basically different proportions and how to accent them and some of the limitations that we might face. All this to say, I want to provide a comprehensive video. Let's first talk about an individual. So let's use a case study. Let's talk about Steve Reeves. And for a lot of people, if you take a look at his physique, what you'll tend to notice in bodybuilders that were in the 50s, bodybuilders in the 40s, all the way up before the 1960s, the chest wasn't emphasized as much. In fact, if we take a look at John Grimek, he has very large shoulders, boulder shoulders, and that is because he was a fantastic overhead presser. The bench press only in the 60s became a more popular movement. So the shoulder exercise was the overhead press, and that kind of was the primary press. And if we take a look at the routine, so someone like Steve Reeves, which I'll post one of his sample, he trained full body. Gee, who would have thunk that? He trained full body. He did a lot of shoulder pressing, so he did some shoulder pressing, and then he also did a lot of back movements and then emphasized the biceps via doing 2 different bicep movements. So all the areas that you kind of see are the areas they train. No shit, what you tend to train will tend also to grow, but everyone's different. Case in point, we could take a look at wrist size, which is a pretty good indicator then of the amount of mass you could put on your arm. Not always, there's other factors, once again, origin, insertion. But if we take a look at wrist size, that can be a big determining factor once again for your arms. If we take a look at your torso, so if individuals, as I said before, who are more torso dominant, that's myself, that's why I could pack on more size on my chest and on my back. How wide your clavicle is, so for myself, I have a wider clavicle, that's why the ass chest exists, and I have a broader frame up top. Once again, we talk about adding more back muscles, but everyone is unique. If you're more narrow, it'll be harder. And so in an individual like Steve, there's 2 things to note. He did a lot right. It's not a mistake that his physique looked the way that it looked. But we have to admit the fact that if we were to take 100 individuals and give them Steve Reeves' routine, they would not look like Steve Reeves. And that's where customization is important, knowing our limits and playing to some of our strengths. And that to me is one of the primary concepts of aesthetics, playing to our strengths. Let's talk about the waist too. So there's several different proportions we're looking at here, right? With Steve, he has the V taper, right? So he has a very wide V taper. That means he has big lats. But again, if you take a look at his torso, he has a slightly wider upper body. So his clavicle, his upper chest area, and then his back. And then he has a tiny waist. So that accents the V taper. If you naturally have a wider waist, that's going to be hard. I'll give you another example. Let's talk about John Grimek. So John Grimek is probably 10 years. He predates Steve Reeves by a few years. And when we take a look at his physique, he was training hard. He was doing a very similar routine. He was a little bit more strength focused. He looks blockier. He looks bulkier. Now, I actually think John Grimek has a fantastic physique. And John Grimek, a lot of the photos we see, he is natural. So that's good. He's a stockier frame. If we look at his waist, it's wider. He's doing a lot of similar movements. So he's emphasizing the biceps. He's doing a lot of overhead pressing. Remember, chest exercises weren't emphasized nearly as much, but what you'll tend to see right there is that for him, he has a blockier frame. But if he's doing a relatively similar routine to Steve Reeves, what's the difference? Well, again, we talk about genetics, but that's not to say that every individual can't try and optimize what they want. And if we want to try and define what golden era aesthetics are talking about, we'd say a tinier waist, so an area that we don't try and emphasize. We want to talk about a wider upper body, so that V taper. We want to talk about putting on size, and you'll notice the Steve Reeves routine, he tended to emphasize the incline bench press versus the flat bench press because he wanted to train the upper pecs. So you train the upper pecs, you build up top here, so think the yoke up here, deltoids. Not a crazy amount, but once again, you want kind of a wide base up top, and then it's like an inverted triangle, and then also giving enough attention to the arms. And here's one of the keys. You want to progressively overload these areas. So aesthetics, if we can all agree, training area will induce hypertrophy. It's all about training certain areas more than others. And that's one of the things that I want to emphasize. When we see someone maybe with an aesthetic physique, it's not like they're training things in a proportional manner. And again, if you want to be a pure bodybuilder, if you want to be a natural bodybuilder, that's completely different. I could say for myself, I respect a lot of the ideals of the golden era. My training itself and my goals are slightly different. They're adjacent, let's say, but I understand and respect them. And I think a lot of people, when they talk about what looks good, they're kind of referring to that era. So how can we customize training for ourselves? Well, understand there's always an opportunity cost with every single exercise that we select. And I want to talk about some key exercises here that should be in your program no matter what, if you care about these muscles and trying to emphasize them. And before I go on, I want to note that Steve Reeves, John Grimek in particular, even more so, when we talk about progressive overload, getting stronger in movements, that was their bread and butter. Okay, so they did these movements and they try to get better at them. So they stuck with core movements. There weren't fancy, oh, do this variation right here and this is going to absolutely blow up your triceps. They stuck with the fundamentals and got better with them over time. And that's a key lesson. But let's talk about 5 movements. We're going to talk upper body more because there actually is, when we talk about the golden era, there's the lower body, but most people, when we talk about aesthetics, we're referring to the upper body, and I'll limit that to this video, talking about the upper body. Eric Helms and myself, he made a fantastic video last year talking all about the quads and the lower body. I'll link that in the description, but let's talk about the upper body. The 5 movements that we want to talk about the incline bench press being one of our primary movements we try and become better at. We want to talk about the overhead press, which should absolutely be a staple. I know some people feel that, oh, like, is it the best shoulder exercise? I really like it. You could overload it. Yes, you could add in some seated dumbbell press, but I'd say the overhead press. I would add as a third exercise the lateral raise. So once again, the lateral head, where when we talk about compound movements, does it get stimulated? A little bit, but not nearly as much. Picking for a barbell or any bicep movement that you could progressively overload. For someone like Steve, once again, really taking a look at his routines, he liked to emphasize the incline dumbbell curl, which extends the stretch on the bicep itself. Pick a bicep movement that you really like, that you feel, try and emphasize that. And lastly, the 5th movement that I would talk about would of course be the pull-up or any rowing variation. If you look at Steve Reeves, who once again had that there V taper, he didn't do a lot of pull-ups. In fact, it seemed like he did some one-arm rows, he did some pullovers, and then he did another back movement. So pull-ups weren't a mainstay for him, but one back movement that could really expand, once again, your lats. So I would put forth the pull-ups. You could even put a straight arm pull down, which I think is a fantastic lat dominant movement that individuals could do. But the 5 movements that you want to have no matter what in your routine and try and get better at them would be the overhead press. This is in no particular order, but the overhead press, the incline bench press or dumbbell press. I do personally like to do with a more shallow bench press. But you could do just a normal one if your commercial gym doesn't have a power rack that you can lower in. That's completely fine. The lateral raise should always be a staple. A bicep curl where you're really trying to get better at it. So don't think with these movements that they're accessories. So the bicep movement is the primary movement. So you're trying to become stronger at it. And for myself, I could be quite honest. I've emphasized a ton of different exercises. I love the bench press, hence the ass chest, and it responds well for me. But things like the bicep curl, I've never really tried to become that much better at them, and I think it reflects a little bit in my physique. And then finally, number 5 would be some pull variation. If you don't respond well to pull-ups, that's okay. You could do a straight arm pull down instead. keep in mind with every single exercise, again, talking about individual variability, for some people, the incline bench press or bench press in general will be great for pec development. Some people are too limb dominant, where they do it, they'll see, you know what, oh man, my triceps, they're really blowing up, but my chest, I really don't feel it. And that's where, once again, substitutions and variations are important. But what you should note, once again, with your training, everything's an opportunity cost, right? If you're doing one movement, it means that you can't emphasize another. And slowly over time, by selecting the right movements for what you want to try and develop, what you'll tend to notice, once again, areas that you train more predominantly will grow. And I know that sounds very intuitive, but take a look at your training, take a look at your physique, and ask yourself, are the two harmonious? Am I doing what I want to achieve the body that I want? And so I wanted to make this video today to say, once again, that I think there are principles and inspiration we could take from the golden era. We also have to recognize that if we do the Steve Reeves routine, we're not going to look like Steve Reeves, but we can use some of those lessons in order to try and min-max our own physique and develop something that is uniquely our own. And that's why I want to say today, bring in the thunder in this video. Thank you so much for watching this video. I decided to make it after I posted myself next to Steve, not at all trying to compare. I think Steve has one of the all-time classic physiques, but just, once again, that's a physique that I respect. It's one of the ones where I take a look at what I find aesthetic. He's definitely up there, right? Him, Zane, there's a handful of individuals. My boy Sandow right here, the original OG, that you could take inspiration from and, again, craft something uniquely your own. I gotta get out of here. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, if you found it useful, if you found it insightful, if you learned something, make sure to like the damn video, and I'll see all you guys, my rascals, in that next one. Peace.
Eat your vegetables, eat your vegetables, eat your fucking vegetables.